When you look at it, every girl in our city has only one thought: I want to. He's young and rich, beautiful, stylish, and cold. A real ice prince. A favorite character for any gossip columnist. Some of the innumerable army of its fans sometimes get lucky, and the next enthusiastic fan gets the opportunity to satisfy the need of his idol in banal sex. Nothing more, no strings attached. However, you can't call him a scoundrel either. Oh, no, he's always dead honest. And any female person who has the chance to be near him always knows that it will only take a few hours and the fairy tale will end. But they, as before, like moths to the fire, strive to plunge into its ghostly radiance, not noticing how their souls break in this freezing vortex. And he, without stopping, passes. And why stay long in one place, why get attached to someone? And only occasionally will a condescending, skeptical grin curl his lips. Rumor has it that he is not able neither to cry nor to laugh. I don't remember who first compared him to Kai, but now everyone is looking forward to the arrival of his Gerda. And even quite seriously speculate, what will this icy perfection be like, turning into a living person? My best friend, and my worst enemy. And I still remember those times when he was always the heart and soul of any company, an inexhaustible source of inspiration and joy, exuding cubic meters of positive emotions. His lips were smiling, his eyes were smiling. He charged everyone with energy, which he had so much that it literally went over the edge and, spilling out, infected anyone who happened to be nearby with fun. It's strange that I'm the last person who still remembers his genuine laugh. And so it happened, the only one who saw his tears. We were 18 years old. Best friends. Young and reckless. The blood was boiling, and the whole world was at our feet. And we always got what we wanted. Our parents' money gave us the opportunity to feel chosen. Not like everyone else. Until she showed up. The quiet girl is not from our circle. At the first moment, when we saw her, we looked at each other, and as always, we understood each other from half a glance. Yes, she was attracted to both of us. But we couldn't get it together. He got it. All I had to do was see the way she was looking at my friend, and I knew I was in trouble. And as much as this girl does not attract me, alas, it remains only to leave and not interfere. There was no point in trying to change anything. They saw each other, and all the others became uninteresting to them. This became clear immediately. It was floating around somewhere, spattering around the vibes of happiness, but I could only be happy for both of them and silently hide a quiet envy. It was then that I believed that love at first sight exists. They literally sparkled when they were together. From them came waves of joy and delight just because a loved one is nearby. I don't remember seeing them break up since I met them. He didn't let go of her even for a moment. Their looks, their smiles, their unspoken phrases that they understood in half a word, their touches. I couldn't help but stare at them, even though my heart was breaking. I couldn't watch either. I could only wish that she would look at me like that at least once. And then I saw what absolute happiness looks like. My friend, drunk with emotion, said they were going to have a baby. She was silent. She only smiled, confused by his delight, which, as always, he was in a hurry to share with the whole world. His parents were against it. All the plans they had made for the future were falling apart. It was too early for him to get married. They were preparing a different life for their boy. First, study, a decent education, time, so that he can just live for himself, grow up and calm down. And the wife of their only son they saw was not so ordinary. He dashed all their hopes with a single sentence, "I'll still be with her." And he left his parents' house, so as not to return. It's hard to give up all the good stuff. Especially if you don't know anything else. From money, from luxury, from the habit of not denying yourself anything. He refused. He didn't think or weigh, or maybe? No. The decision was made, and it was not discussed. For him, the whole world was divided into two parts, those who supported his action, and everyone else. The first ones were much smaller. They didn't have the lavish wedding that girls usually dream of. There was no place to live. She was a long way away, and her parents, while not unwilling to help, were not as generous as he was used to. The option of moving to her hometown was not even considered. He dropped out of school and went to work. But a job without education and parents' connections, there wasn't enough money. And the pregnancy was difficult. We needed money for medicines, for rent, for food, for transport. The young family's budget was bursting at the seams. His parents did not take the keys to the car he had been given. But he couldn't afford to keep her now. He said that he had never thought before that such seemingly small things were accumulating in such unaffordable amounts. Yes, he had learned to count every penny. But how it irritated him. And then there was life. Paradise in the hut did not imply the presence of servants. And he never washed a plate in his life. And here it was all on him. His wife was strictly instructed to refrain from any exertion and unnecessary movements. She was taken to the hospital several times for safekeeping. And he washed, cleaned, cooked. He learned a lot during this time. But this much was by no means a joy. He was angry at work, stressed by the constant economy regime, irritated by household chores, and constantly depressed by the lack of free time. And he took it out on her, on the one who, of course, will understand and forgive. They began to swear. More and more often, instead of "I love," it sounded like "I got it." He was drawn to the familiar life. With a terrible force, I wanted everything that makes up the life of young rich guys. Nostalgically recalling his bachelor existence, he was the envy of your friends. Their opportunities, their carefree fun, their selective responsibility, when you can only think about yourself, your loved one. And he began to evaluate in a different way what he had now, understanding and feeling what he had paid for all this. Of course, in his time, he could be proud of a beautiful gesture slamming the door of his parents' house. It was especially gratifying to realize that my beloved appreciated this gesture. Only, his current life wasn't pretty. It was real and heavy. Too heavy for him. And he was too proud to go to his parents. He was exhausted, irritated, angry with the whole world. And more often, under any pretext, he tried to be as far away as possible from the modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, forgetting about the one that was waiting for him at home. It was her home, but not his. So lovingly arranged, even if it was a temporary nest, it no longer seemed like a cozy and native island of his personal happiness. When we were invited to a birthday party in the country, his wife was already 8 months pregnant. She wasn't invited. And he didn't remember. Not even because she could not go. It is dangerous with the diagnosis, threat of termination of pregnancy. It was just that her presence beside him made him remember that he had voluntarily given up this life for her. She stayed at home most of the time. She was also bored, sad, and lonely. Not only was she physically tired quickly in this state, because every day, imperceptibly and little by little, despite all the prohibitions of doctors, she had to do more and more household chores herself, so also the relationship with her husband gave a crack. She took everything to heart. She was nervous. One carelessly thrown word could bring her to tears. Their communication was kept to a minimum. She didn't even see him every day. My husband was either at work or with friends. I picked him up and waited for him to get ready. It turned out he hadn't told her he was leaving. Knowing about the invitation for more than a week, he didn't take the time to tell her. Or maybe he just didn't think it was necessary, he just put her in front of the fact. And, at the last moment. As a stranger, an outsider. I could see the pain in her eyes. And when she timidly tried to remind me that he had promised to spend at least this weekend with her, I did not listen, went to the kitchen. I was ashamed to be present at their conversation. But even there I could hear their voices, snatches of conversation. She was crying. She asked me to stay. He was angry. I didn't want to waste the weekend cleaning and cooking. After all, he would have to do everything again, but she couldn't. He blamed her for that. She said that he was so rarely around, and she missed him, repeating, like a prayer, that she loved him, that she needed him very much. And that it wasn't her fault that it had turned out this way, his last words. I remember them forever. I think he is, too. He shouted that he hated this life, his job, and her. He did not speak to his wife again. He didn't even look at her. The scene made him angry. She said softly, "I'm sorry," but he stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind him. She did not even notice my presence when I, stunned by his words, confused by such a scene, not intended for outsiders, went into the room to pick up his bag, which he had simply forgotten about. She sat motionless on the edge of the bed, curled up in a ball, and wept silently. I didn't know what to say in such cases. At the time, she had chosen him, not me. Already sitting in the car, I tried to convince him to come back, to make up before leaving, to be softer. After all, it is difficult for her now. Isn't it difficult for me? Stop it. He shouted. I'm so sick of all this. I just don't have the strength. Why do you feel sorry for her and not me? I didn't know what to say. He, the golden child of wealthy parents, after all, really had to fall below an ordinary girl, faced with the realities of everyday life. And I tried to understand him. And then he took out his phone and turned it off. Now it will roar and start ringing. I don't want her to ruin my vacation again, my friend grudgingly replied to the unspoken question. And I cowardly kept silent. The birthday could justify all hopes. Including him. There really was a lot that he missed so much. Maybe a little distraction would lift his spirits, and they would be all right again. We returned 2 days later. He only turned on the phone when my car was pulling up to his house. Almost immediately, there was a beeping sound, announcing missed calls. Oh, only 3. Something is not enough this time. His sarcasm didn't last long. His wife wasn't home. Her things, her phone, even the little money he'd left her, were there. And she's not here. His panicked call made me come back. He asked me to help. I was in the car, after all. We called those friends whose phone numbers he found in the memory of her mobile phone. We drove around the people whose addresses he knew. She was nowhere to be found. It was obvious that he was afraid. Like a jammed automaton, he kept muttering, almost panicking, "She's gone." Yet, despite all his anger, fatigue, and irritation, he could no longer imagine his life without her. When the familiar addresses were gone, we returned. Hearing him open his door, a neighbor looked out from the apartment across the street. "How is your wife? Everything okay?" It turns out that an ambulance took her away. But even in this situation, she was thinking about him, and asked this old lady to let him know where to look for her as soon as he appeared. Everything started spinning again. Shock turned to despair, and feverish joy. It was as if madness had settled in his eyes. He kept hurrying me, even though the hospital was nearby, and even without urging, I drove, breaking all the rules. In the emergency room, when asked about his wife and child, the nurse looked away and asked to wait for the doctor. And then the nightmare began. I was afraid that he would kill the doctor, who told him in a tired voice that his wife and child were dead. Did the doctor care? I don't know. How many people did he tell this to? However, I was not up to the doctor. I had to grab my friend and squeeze as hard as I could. He struggled in my arms, growling like a mortally wounded animal. The doctor calmly called someone. He had to be sedated. Soon he passed out. They could not leave him in the hospital, after all, this is a maternity hospital. They helped me carry him to the car. It was scary to imagine what would happen to him if he woke up alone in their apartment. And I called his father, warning him that I would bring him to their home. They didn't ask, but I told them everything. Even things they probably didn't want to know. Not informing, but accusing. Then, and now, too, I thought it was as much their fault as his. Let them be against the wedding. They wanted to teach their son a lesson, but their granddaughter was due in just a month. The science was too cruel. His mother burst into tears, and his father took her into the next room. When he came to, it was already deep in the night. He didn't say anything, just opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling. Without a single movement. There was a feeling that there was only a shell of him left. He didn't see or hear me. I didn't notice. His eyes were empty. The only way I could get his attention was to mention that her body was in the morgue. The next morning, his father mentioned that he shouldn't go there right now, and that the funeral would be handled by professionals who had already been hired. And he should try to come to his senses. It is clear that there was a tragedy, but we must understand that life does not end there. But, under the empty gaze of his son, he fell silent and lowered his eyes. I didn't recognize her. This gray skin, this body lost under the sheet, frozen forever, sunken eyes, on an unexpectedly thin and strange face. And he looked at her as if she were a god. His dry eyes glittered feverishly. He was literally caressing her, sliding his hand over her face, her neck, and the faded strands of her hair with aching tenderness. I was afraid. He didn't shed a tear, but he was whispering incoherently. He called her the most beautiful, the most beloved, the most desirable. The mortuary worker who had been watching the scene pursed his lips and turned away. I had to drag him out of the unfriendly basement of the hospital almost by force. It was a great funeral. His parents were so blatantly trying to buy off his remorse that I was disgusted to the point of nausea. All the things that his mother and father had regretted during their lifetime, they put into an already unnecessary action. What difference does it make to her now whether she's in an ordinary coffin or not? Their son would certainly not be relieved that more money had been spent on her final resting place than he had been able to earn for her when she was still alive. And a huge number of colors? They will not return the blush to the pale cheeks and make the eyes gleam with joy. Rather, they would remind the living that she had seen too little of them from him when she was alive. He stood silently beside the coffin, one for two. For her and their daughter. A small bundle of delicate, airy lace on her chest, her face covered by the corner of her diaper. His eyes were dry again. Only the fingers that were white from the convulsive effort, with which he held her icy, lifeless hand. He forbade the farewell speech. He only allowed the priest, because she believed in God. The priest was for her. And everything else was for others. He saw all the falseness of what was happening, felt it keenly. And as soon as the beautiful rich coffin was lowered into the ground, he turned around and left. He wasn't at the lavish wake. At first, he often visited the cemetery. Too often. I went there once to pick him up at his father's request. It was then that I saw his tears. For the first time in my life. He was kneeling by the grave. He didn't see me, didn't hear my footsteps. But I could hear him whispering. I'm sorry. Never, do you hear? I never hated you. I loved and still love you, and our girl. I only hated myself. For not giving you what I owed you. For not being able to be strong. You were the meaning of my life, my dear. I hated him. For what happened. For the fact that it is no longer there. But when I heard those words, I knew that I would always be there for him. And not just in memory of her, no. Because he really, really loved me very much. And even if his guilt is undeniable, no one will punish him more than his own conscience. I never followed him to the cemetery again. I know he's still there a lot, though. Even his parents think he's fine now. It's just that their boy has grown up. Others are not afraid of his indifferent gaze, with which he looks at everything and everyone. Everyone thinks that this is such a challenge, a game. That sooner or later there will be a lucky girl who will be lucky, and she will be able to break the icy shell of indifference that envelops him. Everyone is interested to see what the main prize of the winner of the distance in this long race for his heart will be. But the one he handed it to himself will never be with him again. And he just doesn't need the rest.